welcome to the live class called Healing Traumatic Grief. My name is Isabella Viskova. I'm the lead professor at the Gentle Trauma Release Institute, where we train people in the Gentle Trauma Release method to help themselves for their own healing, for their own well-being, but also to help others. My background is in psychology as well as in coaching. I have my own private practice. And about 5 years ago, I founded the Gentle Trauma Release Institute simply because I found that working with people, one of the things that tends to be in their way almost always is trauma. Now, trauma has a lot of faces, and grief tends to be one of those faces. But we usually do not connect grief and trauma. So, today, in today's class, I would love to show you how these two are interconnected, more so than perhaps you might have thought. This class is part of an educational series that we at the Gentle Trauma Release Institute offer to our community. And our hope is that we help you learn about trauma and mostly healing trauma. And that in that way, we empower you through knowledge and through supporting of your well-being. I also love to use the opportunity to hold this class to help you feel what it feels like to be in a gentle trauma release class with us, where we get together, we sit in each other's energy, we are nourished by each other, and we enjoy some learning as we go. I hold virtual office hours just like these every week for our students, and we learn a lot, but these rendezvous are also about nurturing the whole you, not just the learner in you, not just the student, but also the being in you. All right, having said that, let's go to what we have in store for you today. I will talk to you about why grief as an emotion tends to come up specifically at this very time of the year for those of us in the Northern Hemisphere. So it's late autumn right now. And we'll talk about the healing opportunities that late autumn brings regarding that grief. And then I'll switch over to the main topic of this class, which is really, can grief become trauma? And what are the symptoms of that grief? And ultimately, we want to know, can we heal this? Is it possible to heal traumatic grief? And what does it look like? Right. Those of you who follow us on social media have probably noticed our Halloween posts on how the GTR training is peppered with different kinds of magic, quote unquote. And one of those kinds of magic is the seasonal magic. So incorporating seasonal wisdom into the training to highlight some of the topics that to come up with that particular season. And so today I would like to talk to you a little bit about late autumn and traumatic grief that is specifically related to that season. And before I do want to share a story with you. Uh, when I put the gentle trauma release training together, I knew that there had to be several components that always come up when you work with somebody. So what today is our level one is really the basics. It's how to clear a person's traumatic memories, traumatic emotions, how to find their core traumatic memories before traumatic symptoms. So all in all, how to make it so that if somebody has trauma in their system, that it doesn't come back to haunt them again, so that the results are long lasting. But then there were also topics that I knew that sooner or later, if you start clearing somebody's traumas, you would get to those topics. And that became our level two. So it's topics like how to work through transitions in people who let go of trauma, how to help them transition into that trauma free life, or how to work with their inner critic, how to help them renew the connection to their body and develop their body intuition. Now, with these topics, I knew that they would come up, but I never knew in what order. And I used to think that the order in which these other topics come up had to do with people's personalities or where they're at in their life when they come to me. And then about 4 years ago, right around the time when COVID hit and people were not allowed to be in the same room, or at one point, everybody started to be fed up with Zoom. I took the gentle trauma release work outside into the forest with local people, and I started combining the gentle trauma release method with walks. And at that point, that's when it became so obvious that the seasons had to do a lot with that order, with why sometimes a person, once we've cleared enough of their traumatic memories, they need to work on their inner critic, or why sometimes we need to go into their body intuition because it's so underdeveloped. And I realized that it all had to do with the seasons, that certain topics would come up in the springtime, and certain topics would come up in the wintertime. Certain emotions were highlighted in late autumn. And so it was the same in the forest and in the office. When it comes to the emotions, it was always certain emotions, certain unresolved emotions would come up in these particular seasons. Now, if we look at some of the ancient teachings, this would not be a surprise. It's perhaps a little bit of a surprise to us today, where we are a bit disconnected from nature, to learn that we feel and function differently in different seasons, or that there are certain topics that come up with particular seasons. But the ancient teachings, such as the Chinese medicine, believe that we are supposed to navigate every season differently if we want to be happy and aligned with our path. So let's look at where we're now. When I talk about autumn, I am not talking about the early autumn, which is right after the summer, the Indian summer, when it just starts to get a little bit colder, when the temperatures go down, but when it's harvest time. So it's still very or rather warm. The leaves are still up on the trees. They're mostly green, but it's where the plants start to look droopy. That's still, there's still a mellow kind of energy, mellow kind of vibe in the air. What I would love to talk to you about to create a little bit of foundation to that traumatic grief is the season we're in right now in the Northern Hemisphere. And it's really this late autumn. It's when it's really crisp already. Um, Perhaps we are already even past behind the time when the leaves got so colorful. They're already either down or they're just in that late stage of falling down. And this is where the days are shortening. We get much less light, and the process becomes very fast at this time of the year. And all around, nature is just contracting, it's going inward. Um, Even the trees, if you look at what the sap does in the trees, it they draw the sap in so that they can conserve it when winter comes. In North America, you even call it the fall. There's this descending kind of energy. Now, because of this drawing energy, drawing inward energy in the world around us, this is often a good time to, if you work as a practitioner, to take on new clients, or if you want to tackle something of your own, then this would be a good time to do that, autumn, late autumn, because of this pull inward. If you look at the whole cycle, perhaps you found something during the summer that needed your attention. Perhaps you found some skeletons in the closet waiting for healing, but the energy of the summer wasn't quite right to deal with them. And so late autumn carries with it the energy of reconnecting more deeply with ourselves. Of course, there's the topic of letting go, this downward movement happening all around us, this um, not just leaves falling off and the snap being drawn in the trees, but also the plants eventually completely surrender to the force of gravity. The ripened seed falls from the husk onto the earth, descending lower, lower, deeper, deeper, until it gets buried there. So it's this theme of release and surrender in the air. And this is another reason why late autumn is perfect for trauma release work and similar kinds of work. It's the going inwards, but also the letting go. The topic of loss comes up in this late autumn season, and I find this happens particularly in the month of November. This is why I love to teach about this topic in November. It starts in the beginning of November, with Halloween, where this time of the year is traditionally dedicated to remembering the people who have passed away. Here in Europe, where I'm from, people go and visit graves to remember the ones we've lost. We bring flowers to the graves, light candles, pray. In some cultures, such as in Mexico, there's this big celebration, the Day of the Dead, where the whole family gathers to remember and celebrate their loved ones. But even if you look at just the Halloween symbols, the Halloween pumpkins and the skeletons and the zombies, the Halloween costumes, that's another reminder of these ghosts from our past that are alive, memories of things that we didn't manage to resolve within ourselves. And sometimes we might wonder if we ever will. Unprocessed grief is often what's behind people's heavier mood in this late autumn season. It's not just the changes in the weather. On the brighter side, because grief is more difficult to ignore at this time of the year, the season of the late fall is also an opportunity to heal it. Now, the question is, why does grief have a tendency to resurface specifically in late autumn? Well, if we look at the role of emotions for our species, in the most simplistic terms, emotions help us survive. If we experience the quote unquote positive emotions, it's a signal for us that all is well, life is safe, life is good, move forward. You don't need to look behind your shoulder because you're safe. And then on the other hand, the so-called negative emotions that don't feel so good to us, have a different role. They are a message to us saying, don't go there, avoid that, proceed with caution, because all is not quite well at the moment. It's perhaps not safe to proceed. Now let's look at how this works with grief. Why grief? Why late autumn? Grief is a natural response to loss. It's natural and it's what psychology calls adaptive, meaning it helps us survive. It helps us in some way to readjust to the changed circumstances in our life, to course correct and ultimately survive. If you look evolutionary in nature, we humans, we really needed to feel the feeling of loss in late autumn because it made it possible for us to prepare for the long winter. Traditionally, the awareness of losing light, warmth, and harvest would be the signal to our species saying, gather what you can, the food, the wood, the warm clothing, stock up on whenever you need to, because you need to go through this harsh winter and survive, because it is coming. The summer is over. The times when you could just walk around and find food are over. So the survival strategy behind this was oftentimes we feel the feelings of loss and grief as a response to what we are observing in nature, the shorter days, the darkness, the trees standing bare, everything rotting and decaying. And the emotional intensity of loss grabs our attention, leading into a little bit of anxiety because we realize that if we don't get ready, there will be a much bigger loss to face, the loss of our survival. So the bottom line is we are emotionally wired to experience a sense of loss and grief in late autumn, quite regardless of whether there are there's certain kinds of losses in our life right now, or if it's prepare for a loss where the mother nature is telling us stop dreaming about the warm days, abundant with food, get ready for the harsh winter. Now, the interesting part of this story is that late autumn brings a personal, unprocessed grief, not just the recent grief, not just the grief happening around us at the moment, but also from previous seasons, from previous cycles and years. Um, when we lose someone or something that we love, um, we feel grief because it is adaptive for us. It is here to help us survive. When you lose something you loved, it has an impact on your ability to survive. Sometimes it is in the material sense, sometimes emotionally. So the grief is here to help you readjust to these changed circumstances in your life, to course correct, to adapt to the new status quo in your life. And that's the purpose of grief. It's the same thing with trauma. When we are in a situation of imminent threat, we want to mobilize all the energy we have to escape that threat. We fight, we flight, we freeze, whatever we can do to help us survive. And in that sense, the survival response is adaptive, but ceases to be adaptive when the body starts to assume that the threat is still out there, even though it's not. It's gone. It becomes maladaptive. Now, in my client work, I started to realize at one point that the same thing can happen with grief. It can become chronic and very long term without much change in how intense and raw it feels, despite of how much time has passed. Where way after the loss happened, it still feels like it was yesterday, or it wakes up full force periodically, usually when something on the outside triggers it, such as the late autumn season. When grief turns into chronic grief, it becomes maladaptive because it starts to interfere with your life and it starts to express just like any other kind of trauma. To give you an example, one of the very common symptoms of trauma are the so called intrusive thoughts. Thoughts about the traumatic events or experiences from your past that hijack your mind and lead to very uncomfortable feelings. Or it can be thoughts about the bad things that will happen in the future, doom and gloom feeling. And this can happen during the day as thoughts, images, sounds, but also during the night as nightmares. So I noticed over time that people who have been carrying grief over longer periods of time, without that grief really decreasing in intensity uh, as time went by, they would also have these intrusive thoughts, which led to other problems. So almost always in anyone with chronic grief, long-term grief, I would see these grief flashbacks, these emotional states where the person would feel like it was happening again, that loss, as if that loss has just taken place. Um, they would have intrusive thoughts about it, thoughts of anger and disbelief, as in, how could this happen? How is this possible? This is so unfair. This can't be real. And the thought would just spiral in the mind. Um, there would be emotional overwhelm. Um, so person would be overwhelmed and paralyzed by the grief. They very often they have sobbing episodes or moments where they can't stop crying. Usually, when they think about the person or whatever it is they've lost, or when it's brought up in a conversation. Um, for some people, even if they don't feel it throughout the year so much, they would feel like this in late autumn if there's unresolved grief. And then this life freezes in time where it's difficult for a person with chronic grief to reintegrate into quote unquote normal life. Um, this means that the loss restructured the person's life, that life froze to one degree on it or another. For some of them, their career might have frozen or relationships, while for others, that might go fairly well on the surface, but on the inside, they feel like there's this sense of unrealness, this sense of, like in the fairy tales, the kingdom is sleeping, just like when trauma is in a person's system. So, because of all these similarities between trauma and grief, I eventually started to operate from the assumption that the root cause of such chronic grief is trauma, meaning traumatic events and experiences related to the loss, and that this chronic grief is simply one of the symptoms of this unresolved trauma. And to my surprise, I realized that when I treat grief as such, as trauma, and I tackle those traumatic events behind it, it goes away. If I collapse the core traumatic events behind the person's loss, then no more grief flashbacks, no more intrusive thoughts, no more emotional overwhelm, no more feeling frozen in time. So this would be the same process as with any other kind of trauma. As I was putting together the gentle trauma release training, I was working with a woman that I call Angelica in the training. And she is such an excellent example and case study of what it looks like when you work with someone who has this kind of chronic grief. Or if you are one of those people, then just look how it proceeds, what it looks like to release this kind of grief. Um, Before the very first gentle trauma release session, people are always asked to fill in what we call the holistic well-being check-in. It's an intake form where we ask them about their symptoms that they believe could be potentially trauma related, and when those symptoms emerged, what was happening in their life. So this is just a snippet of that intake form, the way Angelica wrote it. There are many things there, and as you can see, um, all of the symptoms practically, she dated the date she put was either 5 years ago or 8 years ago, and this was both of them were related to breaking up with her boyfriend. She broke up with the same guy twice, and that's why sometimes it's 8 years ago, sometimes it's 5 years ago. And right the first symptom, sleep problems, uh, she mentions that she wakes up every night, and this started 8 years ago, wakes up every night between 3 to 4 a.m. and can't fall asleep at that time. So, as you can see in that picture, she really does look kind of exhausted, which is one of her symptoms as well in that intake form. She really does look tired, and it wasn't just on that particular day. Now, the great news is that after I identified Angelica's core traumatic memory related to the breakup, Angelica could sleep well again throughout the night. I worked with her for a longer period of time, so I was checking all this time. Now, let's look at session number 2. As you can see, she already looks much more alive, much more energized. Her voice was more dynamic too. And this might be the effect of both she's more relaxed after our first session, but also she's now sleeping well. One of the things she mentions is she has this cognitive shift that happened between session 1 and 2 is she says there's this theme running through her life where she gets involved in relationships with unavailable men. And she says, I wonder why I have this in my life, why I keep attracting unavailable married men. She wants to be just like normal people. And that leads me to, well, she says there's something that needs to be cleared. And I'm wondering what that might be. However, as is often the case, people tend to first bring up problems and traumas that they are the most ready to deal with at that time. And that's normal. It's called a safe problem. So something that you're ready to work on to heal at that time. Before the second GTR session, gentle trauma release session, people are asked to fill, we call it the emotional freedom plan, where they gather their bothersome memories from their past. This is very often when surprises come up, where huge, big traumatic events that happened to them, but they never mentioned them to you before. So in Angelica's case, big bomb came in her emotional freedom plan before our second session, where she shared that when she was 8 years old, uh, her older brother was 14 at the time, and he went for a school trip one afternoon, and he never came back. And she learned that her big brother, had an accident and drowned in that school trip. Now, Angelica has been carrying the grief around losing her brother for over 30 years. She's around 40 at the time of the session, so this happened when she was 8, so over 40 years. And when I say carrying the grief, I mean all the symptoms of chronic grief that I mentioned earlier. So all the flashbacks and the intrusive thoughts and the emotional overwhelm, all that. Um, Here is an example of emotional overwhelm. So 30 years have passed, and every time Angelica's brother is mentioned, she can't help crying even if she tried. This is that instance that I was talking about where chronic grief feels equally raw no matter how much time has passed. It doesn't decrease over time. It feels like it happened yesterday. By the way, Angelica had intense therapy for this in her adult years. She was encouraged to grieve. She was encouraged to let it all out, to cry as much as she needed. She said she cried every day for half a year, I believe she said, if not 1 year. She actually stopped working to dedicate herself to processing her grief. So if that grief is still there, this intense, this raw, it wasn't for the lack of trying. Now, here's a footage of one of our sessions, and I hope it doesn't freeze my computer, but just watch her face there on the right. I'm reading what she wrote about her brother drowning, and as soon as I mention the brother, she can't help but cry. After 30 years, it's still so alive in her. She can't hold the tears back. Um, So we rolled up our sleeves and began clearing that event. When I say clearing, we have a gentle trauma release protocols that are used right in the session. It took me minutes to walk her through that. It happens during the conversation. There's nothing special needed. I don't want to go into the house of that, but just so you have an idea of what I mean using a protocol. Angelica truly connected with that grief. This is necessary, albeit just for a while. It's not that we're going to talk about this for half a year. What I love to tell people is I need you to connect with it for a short moment. And I want you to know that this is the last time that you feel like this when you think about what happened. So we need that emotional intensity because the brain needs to know what it's working on. The brain needs to know what memory exactly we're clearing. So you can see that the grief was written all over her face there. Um, Here's another footage in there. Let's see if, okay, so you can see that it felt intense. Okay, crying, sorrow. Now, this is towards the end of me using what we call the basic recipe protocols, and you can see how utterly relaxed she is there. Um, to show you another footage here, just watch Angelica there when the video uploads. Notice the sighs. Now she's going to sigh and yawn, so you can see that her body is truly letting go. Okay. The proof is in the pudding, right? So we check in the next session. So the third session comes. I first check for how well she's sleeping. We cleared that about a month ago. She's still sleeping fine. She's smiling. She's sleeping peacefully. Now I go to check the memory of the brother. I when I'm checking, the memory was truly cleared. I am not trying to avoid the triggers. On the contrary, I'm using the words that I know that would normally be a trigger for that person, and I will see if something changed. So here I talk about quote unquote losing her brother, for example. And even if even upon hearing those words, she's relatively calm. um, we actually even get some smile there where she says, well, it gave me acceptance. I can't hold on to this like a little girl, hold on to having lost her brother. Um, I literally ask her to go back to that memory, to go back to that tragic accident and see how she feels when she thinks of that memory. She's not crying or not even thinking about that memory, going through it. In fact, you see that her face is calm. She has to look for her new feelings. That's why the eyes are looking upwards. She's trying to assess what she's feeling. And she says, I don't have that sad feeling of he's not coming back. I'm accepting it. And her body is congruent with her words. She's calm as she said that. Now, interestingly enough, when I had my sessions with Angelica still, um, again, I was acting on this understanding that her chronic grief was a traumatic symptom. And just so you know, it also emerged as an official diagnosis. There's something called prolonged grief disorder as of 2, 3 years ago. This is really traumatic grief. Um, Now, there's so much more to grief than just this new diagnosis, though. What you want to realize is that grief is usually not about pure loss, not purely about we lost something dear to us. Um, when we lose someone or something that we love and cherish, it's almost always accompanied by a sense of shock. And this shock can relate to, I didn't see this coming. For example, there was an unexpected tragedy, such as in Angelica's case, or it was an unexpected end of life, maybe an accident, or I didn't have time to say goodbye. Then the shock can relate to how the loss happened. If there was violence, if there's cruelty, negligence, or when it disrupts our chronological understanding of time. For example, when a younger person dies before an older one, that of course would cause shock. Finding yourself unequipped to move forward. For example, when somebody becomes an orphan, and how will I survive? Death, as such, is often a shock for many. Just the idea of realizing what the body looks like, behaves like, smells like when there's no more life in it. Now, shock is a telltale sign of traumatization. No matter what experience we go through, if there's a huge shock involved, there is trauma. And it just so happens that big losses are more often than not accompanied by a huge shock. Here's a story that one of our students shared in our Facebook group a couple of days ago when I asked about what people thought is their connection between grief and trauma. And this describes it perfectly. She talks about how her mother's passing uh, proved to be both grief and trauma. It was unexpected. It left her and the whole family in shock. We still do not what happened, she says. My mother was to come home from the hospital the day before everything changed, and she didn't, and nobody knows what happened until today. And she tried therapy. She was bedridden for 4 months. In therapy and in counseling, they looked at this as quote unquote depression. They would have her talk about what happened, the grief, but she says here it only made things worse. Talking about it over and over again actually made me angry. I was reliving that heart wrenching grief. And it was only after gentle trauma release that I was able to let go of the shock, grief, and anger that my nervous system was holding on to. Yes, because she looked at the root cause of it. The root cause wasn't the grief as such, it was the shock. So to put it differently, uh, this is a great example showing you how shock, which is that tail sign of trauma, cannot be talked away. And it just so happens that rather often that shock is present at the same time as the loss that we suffer. They often go hand in hand. And because those two things happen together, your brain treats them as one, the grief and the shock. And unless you do something about the shock, until you release the trauma that has to do with that shock, the grief will never leave because it's traumatic grief. It's not just pure grief where, for example, your great grandmother had a full life, she lived up to 105, and you anticipated that it would soon be her time to go. In fact, you feel blessed to have had her around for so long. Everyone had time to say goodbye. She died in her sleep, peacefully, with a smile on her face. There's no shocker there. This would be the kind of grief that would dissipate over time, or that would even fill you with gratitude and love and nostalgia when you think of all the precious moments you spent with your great grandmother. But most of the time, this is not how loss goes. Usually, the shock is present in one way or another. Let me give you another example. Oftentimes, on top of the loss, there's this, I call it an extra blow. So that's when, in your darkest hour, when that loss is happening, you're facing a difficult loss, you also experience betrayal or abandonment or injustice. Very often these are personal, where that extra blow comes from someone you believed would be there for you in that dark hour of loss. This is usually someone you believe deep down that they're your rock, they're your support, your safety zone, that there's somebody you can rely on when the worst happens. But imagine if that person turns on you or betrays you or abandons you even emotionally, then what would that feel like? It would feel like there's nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, nowhere to be safe. Now, this betrayal or this abandonment, uh, it really often is interpersonal, as in partner, parent, best friend, but also institutions that you trust, that you believe would be there for you when something horrible happens. And imagine that a tragedy does happen and nobody cares. Not people, not institutions, nobody's trying to make things better. The injustice can come into play, for example, where there's an element of the loss being avoidable. For example, someone acted in a way that they were not supposed to act, that drunk driver who should have never gotten behind the wheel, or the doctors who perhaps should have checked for something and they didn't. Perhaps they neglected something. And the result of it is a loss that feels would have been avoidable. Or you might have unfinished business with someone. Maybe you hope for an apology for what they've done to you, and now the apology will never come. You can even apply this not just to losing someone, but something that was important to you. I mean, we had the elections recently, and some people on the line are not from the US, but even for those of us here, Europe, we all felt it. No matter what, who was your favorite candidate. And so normally there would be just grief over the loss, but traumatic grief is there when there is this betrayal, abandonment, injustice. So, for instance, uh, some women might feel betrayed by other women because they voted for a candidate who, in their view, um, is a representative of patriarchy. Or you may feel betrayed by that neighbor because they voted for someone who you believe to be corrupt, or your friend, or your family member. Where the shock comes from, well, I thought we were on the same page regarding this important value, or I thought we were right, and therefore I could trust you. Now I can see that I was dead wrong. Doesn't matter which side. It both sides felt it. So traumatic grief often comes with this theme of being kicked while you're already down. So in Angelica's case, losing her brother actually wasn't the only terrible thing that she went through at the time. There was another memory that Angelica put into her emotional freedom plan, and it was the memory of being 9 years old, so perhaps a year after her brother tragically died. And she says, my mother told me that there will be a letter for me that she wrote. She will put it in a drawer and I can read it at the end of the day when I come home from school. And the letter said that she wanted to get away and was not coming back. She wanted to become a nun and wanted to stay in a monastery. Angelica is from Thailand, and that's why her mother becoming a nun and going to a monastery. And I didn't correct her English either, just so you could see the way she wrote it. Um, so, of course, as a child at the time, I was sad, scared. Ultimately, the mother actually did come home, but never explained what happened. One of the things that Angelica shared in that session was that she remembers how every day she would come back from home from school and her mother would be there just staring into nothingness. Um, she says that she felt like she and her little sister practically didn't exist in her mother's eyes anymore. And that's how we come to understand in that session and when she talks about this particular event the main reason why Angelica was holding on to her grief for over 3 decades. Unconsciously, she was hoping that if she kept holding on to her grief, her mother would eventually notice that she too was grieving. So, after releasing these two memories of brother dying tragically from this event that you see on the slide, the memory, that's where everything shifted and she was finally able to let go. Now, to make long story short, what is it that led to these powerful results in healing traumatic grief? And that's something that we replicate time and time again and works. First of all, uh, what worked was approaching that grief as trauma. So I needed to get to the traumatic events behind her trauma, and I needed to tackle the memories that had to do with two sort of themes. Number one, the shock accompanying the loss. Um, so in Angelica's case was the how it happened. It was a tragedy. Nobody told her what happened. She was confused. But then also, more often than not, you have to find the memory that has to do with that extra blow, the betrayal, the abandonment, the injustice that came with the grief. And that was the case with Angelica's mother wanting to abandon her two children and leaving a letter that she would just abandon them and become a nun. So the thing to realize is that traumatic grief is really two things in one. It's when sorrow and anger combine. And so we need to tackle the sorrow and the sadness that relates to the loss, but also the fury that relates to betrayal, the abandonment, and the injustice. We need to work on both. I will come to you in a second, but just to finish off with Angelica so that you know how things work for you. So, for her, when I was clearing the event, in the beginning, she was beginning to relax, and that's great. But at the same time, she said, um, I feel really relaxed, but at the same time, when I think of that memory of her mother wanting to leave them, I'm really angry. No, normally, anger could be something is still left unresolved, but in this case, because it had to do with that sense of extra blow, that abandonment, that betrayal. This is something that we want to see in Angelica because before she was just apathetic. Now we continue working with that. I call this the empowered anger, by the way. It's a good kind of anger. And as you can see in this picture, she's angry, but it's kind of playful anger, that empowered anger. She starts to see how not accessing it, not realizing that she was really hoping to get her mother's attention for 30 years has put her back in her own life. She was not able to move forward. Um, Here she's smiling. She says, I'm just really angry. And she says it playfully. She calls her mother that selfish woman like that, playfully. Um, and then she realizes that holding on to this grief, she says here, it was such a waste of time and energy in my life. I was just wasting all my life with her stuff. Here again, she's becoming playful as she realizes that not long before this session where we cleared the event, her mother called her and said that she wants to go to live in a monastery. Again, as if life knew that that was the time that we worked on this very topic. And she called Angelica saying, I want to become a nun. I want to go and live in the temple. And she says, I need to give away this cat that I love so much. And Angelica says, well, that really hurt me because that was the exact same thing as before. But then instead of feeling sorry for herself and going into grief, which would be her normal pattern, Angelica actually starts to joke about it. She says, this cat will probably be better off without her anyway. And she's laughing, as you can see in that picture. So as I do the final check-in, here you can see, I ask her to bring back the memory of her mother wanting to leave a letter revealing her plan to leave the family for good. And, the picture says it all. Angelica says, she's laughing. She says, I feel really light. I feel like something just flew off me. And that brings me to what does a healed grief really look like? You will know that your own grief is healed or your clients is when there's number one, this calm acceptance of what is. This doesn't mean that we love what happened. This doesn't mean we're happy about the loss we suffered. It's just we accept that loss too is a natural part of life, and we are kind of calm and okay about it. True letting go is also a sign of a healed grief. So, no more intrusive thoughts about why this happened, what could be, what could have been, the thoughts of injustice and disbelief. Pause and stop hijacking the mind. What happened doesn't need to be on your emotional or mental radar anymore, and you can truly move on. Healed grief oftentimes, almost always, comes with this enhanced appreciation of life. It allows you to transform the loss that you suffered into valuable lessons and appreciation of life. And as a result, you end up with a widened perspective on life, a sense of reverence, and an enhanced ability to appreciate the gift of life that you still have left. Time and freezes for you, and you can truly move on. So I will come to you, and if you have any sharings, questions, etc., I would love to hear from you. Janina, I see your hand. Hi.
I would really, really love to share something with all of you, and I think it fits so well to that class. So shortly after I got certified in GTR, which I think now is around 2 years ago, I started to have several clients with like one theme, and it's has up until that point, or it was this one topic I could not handle, as in after the sessions, I would break down in tears. It's the same. I just could not cry. And it was the topic of miscarriage, losing a child. And I had 3 or 4 clients in a row coming with that topic. So, and I could feel it's not just me being empathetic, because obviously it's excruciating, but it does something with me. So I was like, okay, what could that be? I have never been pregnant. I've never lost a child. What is that? So working with GTR myself, I quickly made the connection to a time when I was 14, 15. And in a very tragic way, I lost my cat, who was in that time the only family member I felt safe with, good with. She was my everything. So apart from losing her, how it was communicated to me was terrible. So I pretty quickly made this connection, worked with GTR, and I realized I can handle these topics with my client better now. Additionally, I was open to get a pet again, which I haven't been all these years before. Just the idea of getting a dog, a cat, I would immediately freeze. So now I have my dog, super happy. And yeah, I think this is a great example of how this chronic grief can show up and can be related to these traumatic memories.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. The reason why I always said losing someone something is precisely that. Normally, you know, pet, it feels just like losing a person. There's no difference, and we would treat it just the same as losing
Yeah.
someone who's human. Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you very
And I
much.
love this really this the relationship, the loss and the shock. I didn't see it coming. She was there every night, sleeping next to my head. I didn't anticipate she wouldn't come home one day. And then the way how I was told that the neighbor kids found her in a very tragic way. So the entire thing was just literally everything you just talked about. So I can now be better there for my clients because I'm not breaking down every time after, and could open up myself to get a new pet. So yeah.
Hello, ladies. Hello, Isabella. I love this
Hi.
class. Really love this class. It was so good. So yes, I know chronic grief because that's what I wrote that you shared, and thank you for sharing that. I hope it helps others. Um, and I just want to touch on talk therapy, bereavement counseling, because that's what I went. I went to grief counseling, and I just felt like this woman is not understanding my pain. And what was happening was, rather than focusing how my body was interpreting that shock, it was the narrative recall, just recalling it over and over. And I just kept reliving it over and over because it was a complete shock. We lost our mother in 4 days. She was supposed to have come home for Easter, but we were in the funeral home at Easter. So I do believe there was some negligence. I did some research, but I kept hitting a brick wall. And then I did, before, this was way before GTR, but I did give up because I realized I'm not getting anywhere. But what happened was, after I had GTR, I think it was about 3 sessions. I've come to a place where just total acceptance and gratitude for the time that I had with my mother, and that how blessed I was to have had a mother like her, because I not only lost a mother, I lost a best friend. And, and then I realized that, thank God for what I believe in, because I believe that maybe her time was up. Maybe this was her soul's contract. So however, it was just a place where total surrender and acceptance, but recalling and re-talking and bringing it up over and over doesn't solve anything, because it's the way everyone interprets trauma differently. For me, I went into collapse, bedridden for 4 months. They looked at it as depression. I was prescribed medication, and they missed it. So thank goodness for this and for this method and everything else, because I can talk about it now. And I'm not okay that my mother passed away, but I'm okay, if that makes any sense.
Yes, thank you. I had a lot more slides prepared in terms of why the traditional methods, the mainstream methods, wouldn't work for this. It's a whole other chapter. But the long story short is, you have to engage the body as you're working with somebody. The talking does exactly what you said, the reliving. And the reliving does nothing to release the trauma. We have to communicate to the body that it's safe. And in the gentle trauma release method, we do it through targeting the vagus nerve, the psoas muscle, and some other muscles. And the protocols are so easy to incorporate into a coaching session or into a therapy or healing session. You don't have to focus exclusively on trauma. If you're doing something else, you're a business coach, you're a fitness trainer, you work with menopausal women, you just throw it in there when appropriate.
A client was introduced to me in my community to come join some fitness classes here to help her deal emotionally with her being widowed suddenly 2 years prior. And I was taking my GTR training at the time. And then during COVID, things got worse for her, right, with the isolation. So she was frozen in time. So, for example, I was worried about her. Like, she was rattling around this big empty house where she'd raised her kids and they were grown up. Her partner that she expected to retire with was gone within 2 weeks of a cancer diagnosis, 2 weeks gone. And she had this old dog, totally sweet, but she would sit at the table and serve herself and her dog a meal and cry. I'm like, oh my gosh, if this dog dies, we're going to lose her. So I finally encouraged her to do GTR when I was trained to do so. So we worked together for about 6 calls and cleared some other things leading up to the couple of big ones with her husband. And what happened is, she immediately went into next phase. She sold that big house, moved to a community closer to her daughters, got involved in some community stuff, like whatever exercise classes were in the community. And she just got out of that horrible rut where she was stuck. So it didn't take long.
Probably those of you who are practitioners, or even other coaches and practitioners on the call who are not trained in GTR, you are probably asked a lot of the times, does this work not affect you? When people share their tragedies and their pain with you. And before I used GTR in my practice, I would honestly have had to say, yes, it does. But when you have this in your pocket, there's just this pure joy because you know that they will not have to feel like this for that much longer once you get your hands on them, so to speak. So thank you
Yeah.
for this amazing example. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Ramona. So let me tell you this. If somebody has questions, please stay on the line. If you would like to ask me about the training, about what level is best for you, is this a good time for you to join? I will stay and answer your questions. And I would love to conclude that if um, late autumn comes, if November comes, and you don't feel grief at this time of the year, you know that you solved the grief from previous seasons. However, if the days start to get darker in November and your heart starts to get a little bit heavy and you're wondering why, there's a great likelihood that it might be that unresolved grief from your past. And I hope I've managed to communicate the message today that grief is not just grief, that more often than not, grief and trauma are connected. And unless you do something about that trauma piece, that grief will not solve itself over time the way we're told about, like, that, grief, it will no longer be there when you wait after the passage of time. It just doesn't happen with traumatic grief. So I hopefully managed to give you some hope that grief too can go away and that your heart doesn't have to suffer any longer than it's necessary. And you can be at peace, you can be happy again, you can move on with your life. Step into a world where healing is tangible and long lasting. Welcome to a glimpse of the Gentle Trauma Release Training. As coaches, healers, and practitioners working with clients, we share the profound privilege of guiding others through their personal journeys. But often, there are wounds that remain unhealed, hindering the progress and happiness of our clients. We know the joy and fulfillment that come with witnessing our clients' growth, but we also understand the weight of unresolved trauma. Now, imagine being equipped with easy-to-use tools that would allow you to facilitate powerful trauma release. Imagine knowing exactly how to guide your clients through the depths and the variety of their emotional experiences. What would it feel like to always feel reassured that you have what it takes to help your clients, no matter what they bring to the table? Let's together dive into immersive modules of the Gentle Trauma Release Training, where you'll be guided to learn to create lasting shifts and healing in your clients so they can truly reclaim their lives, their happiness, well-being, their sense of purpose, their connection to others and to themselves.
I can't say enough about how much this is going to help you as a coach. You will never be the same again. You will see so many issues now through the lenses of understanding trauma. So I stand here with you as one of these family members who's here to support you and yay, cheer you on.
My name is Izabela Viskupova, and I'm the founder of the Gentle Trauma Release Institute. Our mission is to help you as a student and a practitioner so that you can help others. Come and join the students and practitioners who have witnessed clients release trauma and experienced genuine healing and transformation using the Gentle Trauma Release method. We would love for you to become one of us and welcome you to the Gentle Trauma Release Training.